Good morning, church. Great to see you all this morning, and welcome to all the new friends among us. For those who are new, we've been studying the book of 2 Samuel for the last couple of weeks. Just as some background information, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel address questions of the nature and purpose of Israel's monarchy and Israel's covenant relationship with Yahweh as king. By presenting contrasting portraits of Israel's first human kings, these two books serve a programmatic function for Israel's future perceptions of monarchs, as well as for individuals in God's kingdom. In the book of 1 Samuel, we see that Saul has failed and been rejected as king because he did not obey the voice of the Lord. David has been made king and taken Jerusalem, where the ark is brought, symbolizing God returning to his people. Two opposing views of kingship are contrasted between Saul and David, with David exemplifying humility before Yahweh. After over 400 years, the words of Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 10 to 11 are being fulfilled. Rest and a place for Yahweh's name to dwell. David wants to establish his city definitively as the promised place where the Israelites will go to worship. David, like any other ancient Near Eastern ruler, is seeking legitimization for his kingship. If he is allowed to build a temple for the God of Israel, that will put beyond doubt that Yahweh has chosen him and his descendants as Israel's royal dynasty. How is the Lord going to respond to David? That is where today's talk is going to pick up. Let's look at today's passage, 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 4 to 17. The first point we're going to look at is that God will build the house. From verses 4 to 5, we see that this passage is a prophetic revelation to David from God through the prophet Nathan. David is told that he will not build God a house, but on the contrary, God will build him a house. This language of house has been coming up in this passage repeatedly. They're used in a number of ways. Firstly, as a dwelling place, such as in verses 5 and 6, where comparisons made, where David was dwelling in a house and God was dwelling in a tent. The second way that we see house is through the language of verses 11, where house is referred to more as a dynasty or a line of offspring. Here we should see that God is making a covenant with David, which uses terms that are reminiscent of the patriarchal promises in Genesis. The covenant is to establish David's house or dynasty through his seed. Please note the singular form meaning the offspring. As we read on to the verses 14 and 15, we see that God will have a parental relationship of discipline with his son, rather than reject him when he is disobedient like the previous king Saul. This son will build the temple. God gives David legitimization of his kingship and royal dynasty, despite him not being the one to build the temple. The implication here is that through David, the promises to Abraham are coming closer to completion. The other way that we can see home being used is in verses 10, where God is speaking of providing a place for the Israelites to have as a home. The second thing we're going to look at when we explore God's covenant to David is this concept of forever. In Hebrew, the term olam can mean a long time rather than eternity, and it's been used before in Samuel. So it's not really a new idea. In those situations, God had previously revoked promises that had used this word olam. Therefore, there were no guarantees of an eternal, irrevocable promise. So David would most likely have understood it as a limited promise, conditional on the obedience of him and of the future kings. It only became eternal when later prophets during the post-exilic period picked it up and turned it into a messianic hope, despite the fact that the royal line was broken and the line had been taken away from David. And so this covenant provided this foundation for an eternal messianic hope. This brings us to our third point, that God's promise is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. This passage that we've been looking at is actually proto-messianic rather than directly messianic. It draws a contrast between David at his best as God's ideal for kingship and the failures of the later part of David's reign. This gap between ideal and reality anticipates the thinking of the later prophetic and explicitly messianic texts, such as Isaiah chapter 2 verses 1 to 4, chapter 11 verses 1 to 9, Jeremiah chapter 23, Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 24 to 28, which speak of a future anointed king from David's line, a Messiah whose glorious reign will rescue the line of David from the disgrace into which it had fallen. So Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament's yearnings for a king like David. The New Testament writers took their cue actually from Jesus himself. 3 of Jesus' claims concerning himself allude to this passage. Firstly, he claimed that he would build a temple. And you can find that in Matthew 26, and also chapters 26 and 27, Mark in chapters 14 and 15, and John chapter 2. He also claimed to possess an eternal throne. Again, you can check that out in Matthew 19, verses 28 to 29. And he claimed also to possess an imperishable kingdom. And that you can see in Luke chapter 22, verses 29 to 30, and John chapter 18, verse 36. So how does this apply to us? Well, God is ultimately the builder. And it is God who graciously blessed and forgave David, though David did not deserve kingship. Likewise, God has laid the foundation for us spiritually in Jesus Christ, who is the cornerstone and the vine, the central foundation for which we place our faith on, not based on what we do, but based on what God does. And He builds that faith in us. And so we should stand firm in our assurance of salvation by His grace. Let us praise the covenant God who again chooses to bless His people in an undeserved way with unreserved kindness. Amen.